So this is a conversation with Lina Mounzer. She's a Beirut-based writer and translator who, like me, took part in the October and post-October protests in Lebanon. I wanted to catch up with her to talk about how she started preparing for the worst yet to come very early on. This anticipation of economic hardship, of violence, is a widespread phenomenon in Lebanon, but not a lot of people are able to express it so accurately like Lina does. I know I've struggled to do so. Lina experienced the ups and downs of the revolution. She wrote the moods and experiences and facts in her diaries as they were happening, and she has clearly deeply thought about what the past several months in Lebanon have meant, and even the past few decades. We talked about Lebanon, about revolution as a quote-unquote feeling greater than love, which is also the title of a Lebanese film, and why many people actually miss the civil war, or rather are so tired of the present uncertainty that the past certainties, however horrible, were easier to digest. And we even talked about the impact that the Italian Jewish writer and Holocaust survivor Primo Levi's writings have had on her. This is why I was really looking forward to having this chat with her, and I hope you also enjoy it. As usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter @FireTheseTimes and on Instagram @TheFireTheseTimes. And if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon on buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and buymeacoffee.com has both options. Thank you for your time.
So my name is Lina Mounzer, and I'm a writer first and a translator second. And yeah, that's it right now. Those are my two full-time jobs.
Awesome. So we'll start talking about your essay, Letter from Beirut, From Revolution to Pandemic. It was published last month, so April 2020, which is roughly half a year basically since the October Revolution started in Lebanon.
Yes.
You mentioned that early on in the uprising, you started planning on how to phase out your reliance on mood-stabilizing medication. And you started phasing it out in early November, and obviously I'll just let you talk about this. The thing that really caught my attention while I was reading this is how you were preparing in advance for the worst yet to come, in a sense. And this feeling of, رايحين على الانهيار, like we're going to a state of collapse, which, was turned into a meme, and we made jokes about it and everything. This kind of, this anticipation of violence, essentially, it's very widespread. So can you talk a bit about that feeling and your experience with it, essentially since October?
I mean, it's a thing. It's not a single feeling, actually, because if I look back on it, it's something that happened in waves or in phases. So back in November, when I started phasing out the medication, I had this kind of very logical knowledge that, the economic crisis is coming. We were already feeling its effects. So, إنه lira كانت عم تقسط, and so I knew very logically, as did everybody, that we are heading into an economic downturn and that things were going to be very difficult. So I made that choice very logically to start phasing out the medication because it was quite expensive on the one hand, and I really did have this fear of that it was actually going to ينقطع من السوق, like I wasn't going to be able to find it anymore, and I didn't want to have to get off of it cold turkey. And also at the same time, I was really, really high. I think all of us were so high off of the energy of the thawra. And so I felt like, okay, I can sort of face anything. And that included first getting off the medication, and second, also kind of the economic collapse, the economic crisis that was coming. So it was like, when they say like forearmed is forewarned, it really felt like, okay, we know what's coming. And yes, it's going to be difficult, but, revolution isn't easy. And this kind of like sea change that we've been waiting for decades and decades to have happen in Lebanon, we know it's not going to be easy. We know they're not going to leave without a fight, but we're here and we're willing to fight. And, it was very much that feeling, which I'm sure and I know for a fact that you shared, yes. Right?
Yeah.
And so I started phasing myself off of the medication, and and then little by little things started to get worse. عم يتدهور الوضع, I find that kind of like the perfect word to describe what was happening. And it kind of crept up on me weirdly, even though I thought that I knew, what I was in for. And I mean, like, in for in terms of, both the side effects of phasing out the medication and the economic crisis itself. Not just the economic crisis, I think it was just the way that the turn that the protests took when more and more people started leaving the streets.
Yeah.
And there was a point, like, now I look back on it, because, on Twitter, I'm usually fairly sober in the sense of, like, I don't just say whatever it is that I'm feeling. But after one of the protests, I had like a complete freak out on Twitter, and I was just so incredibly angry. It was when we were blocking the roads, like before the parliament session where they voted in the government.
Yeah.
And it was I actually wrote about that day in detail in my journal, and it was just such an awful day. I remember just like bone cracking cold, waking up like at just before dawn, going down to the streets. And, I look around me at the people, and I'm always so moved by their incredible dedication, because you really do see people from all walks of life, people of all ages, and everybody is standing there together. And that day was it also felt so incredibly futile. And, these people would pass by as we were standing there, and they would honk their horns. And I remember, this is something that always happens, right? That people, when they drive by and there's a protest, they honk their horns. And it used to be something that felt like really exciting, like it was an act of solidarity. It's like, okay, they're in their cars, we're standing on the street, but like all of us are in this fight together. And I remember that day just feeling like so angry. It's like, don't honk your horn. Either get the fuck out of the car, or just don't honk your horn. And it wasn't necessarily logical, but I was just feeling this incredible sense of resentment that I think was just coming from exhaustion, like on my behalf, on everybody else's behalf. And I think that day for me marked a kind of turning point, because it really felt like, the turnout was really not bad considering the circumstances and considering like how late it was in the protest. But I think the fact that they kind of pushed through regardless, and they had the session and they voted in the government despite the fact that they didn't have a quorum, كان في خيبة أمل كبيرة, If I look back, it's all of these different phases, like different things were happening at the same time. And it was hard for me actually to connect the two things, to say like, well, what I'm feeling now is like a kind of side effect of, let's say, a withdrawal of like, psychiatric medication. Because it really was. I have like a rapid cycle bipolar disorder. And it was, for me, the thawra was exactly that. It was like the high was like this complete manic phase. And then the low was just this terrible depression. And, so it was, in a way, it was mirroring, the whole country was living on this like up down roller coaster. So how do you disentangle like the workings of your own mind from what's like happening outside yourself as well? That's where all of that came from. And I think everybody was feeling this, there was throughout this just sense of collectivity. And it was like that collective feeling is what allowed me to feel like so ecstatic, so connected to everybody. And I also felt like that was why the economic collapse, or, collapse, it's like this slow kind of tadahur. It felt so painful because it felt like all of us had connected together and kind of acknowledged the fact that we were all connected together. And so now everybody having to suffer and you having to watch everybody suffer, it just felt so much more painful and so much more awful, if that makes sense,
Absolutely. And so I was also there on that day, and I was at the top, next to Stock, or on top of the bridge, and I just so a bit of context for other listeners, there was Parliament was supposed to meet, and Parliament did essentially meet, and they ended up voting on these sets of laws, and despite, as you said, not having quorum. But on the psychological side, in a sense, the reason why when I read that sentence that you were kind of planning ahead, that for me kind of really it really struck me in a sense, because I was seeing a therapist up until October, and then I told the therapist I'm going to stop for some time because I'm doing fine right now, and it was really the high of the protest, which you described it beautifully. It was really a high. Like I was the energy I was feeling was not just mine. I was actually kind of taking energy from people around me and giving some of it back, and it was really a collective thing. And that day, I guess, I don't know personally for me when I started feeling that it was kind of like on the downturn. Maybe that day was actually when things started feeling for me as well. But so there's this a sentence that you wrote in the essay. I'm going to read it now. Everything had fallen apart by then, though, from my mind to the country to the Thawra revolution. And so it was hard to identify the source of the disease. Was it coming from inside my rotten brain or from the rotten world? And, that's what you mentioned. Do you have the diary entry of that specific day in front of you?
The diary entry of that specific day. Let me see.
January 12th.
So I said, the first thing I did when I started to take the news seriously was to start weaning myself off of my cray pills. That was back in mid-November. Honestly, I'd been looking for any sort of excuse. I hate paying for them. I hate having to remember to take them. I hate the idea of them. I hate forgetting to take them and then only realizing it the next morning when I wonder why I feel so groggy and dizzy and like my head is stuffed full of shit clumped hay. I think they helped in the beginning, but at this point, مثل قلتهم. So I started to taper off the dose, taking off 50 milligrams at a time, the way they said to do it on the internet. When I got to the last 50, I tried doing 25 milligrams a day, cutting the 50 pill in what approximated half, but then I tired of this very quickly. So here I am, off the Lamictal since late December, I think, and my head is still groggy and thick and sludgy. I think I don't know how to write anymore. I know I've said this at many points in my life, but now it feels real. I feel stupid, straight up dumb, bad diction, bad thoughts, ugly perspective on everything. Not that optimism is any stand-in for intelligence. But not enough imagination to think my way out of depression, let alone out of bed in the morning.
And reading it now, a few months later, how do you see the situation changing?
Oh, it's funny. It's like such a simple question, but it also feels like such a big question.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to answer it, because how is it changing? I mean, like depression is a very, it's a very up and down thing, even if it's not like straight up bipolar, even if a person is not straight up bipolar, depression itself is like, it's like you're constantly riding a roller coaster, right? Mm-hmm. Like you're going up and down and trying to figure out how to navigate like your own mind. And it's fucking exhausting. But I mean, just the way that it's changed is, I think if I look back on that time and I look at these, I look at all of these entries, it's actually the only way that I can describe it is almost like it's a visual thing. Like it's almost like the light has been leached out of those memories. Like I look back and I see something that's like very, very, very dark. And part of it is like the January cold, and it gets dark early. And, I've always had this, the way I describe it to myself is sort of like, I don't know where like the boundaries of my skin are, like where the boundary exists between myself and the world. Yeah. So everything sort of leaches in, whether it's like the landscape or the colors or the weather or this, or like they just sort of inhabit my mental state and they feed off of each other, Yeah. And so when I look back on that, it's like a mix of all of those things. There's something that feels very sludgy, very dark, very cold, like this inability to move. I feel like my entire body hurts. It's different now because the whole world is different now. Like if you want like the entire collective mood now also uh, feels very different. Like now I have more of a sense of claustrophobia. Back then it wasn't so much claustrophobia as much as it was just like a complete lack of energy, like a complete lack of energy. It's,
Yeah,
it's
exhaustion.
hard to explain. Exhaustion. And it's funny because like reading these words back now, they're just words somehow,
Yeah.
you know? Like I can't, and this has always been the issue, and I think this is the issue for everybody as well, is that you can tap into the theoretical experience of a thing. You're like, oh, I know what that feels like. Somebody tells you what pain is. You're like, oh, I know what that feels like. I know what it's like to have a headache. But you actually don't, like something as simple as having a headache. You actually, you know theoretically what it is, but until you have a headache, you forget how completely on all consuming it is, and how it is a thing that you actually, it's not that you can't stop thinking about it. It's that it inhabits you every moment. So you're like getting a glass of water, your head is pounding. You're trying to lie down, your head is pounding. You're trying to think of something else, your head, So when you read about, I have a headache, you're like, oh yeah, I know what a headache is like. But you know what I'm trying to say, right? Like
It's yes,
you forget the visceral experience of a thing. And I
yeah.
think depression is very much like that as well.
Like one way I've been trying to, I'm trying to write this piece, and it's gotten nowhere yet. But one way that I'm trying to visualize this, because I kind of visualize everything. Like my memory, I feel is very visual, and I see the experience of the revolution, and especially, the first 5 weeks or so, 5 6 weeks or so, as almost like I had this out of body experience, and the body is the collective body. So like I had an out of body experience, but it wasn't even my body that I was exiting in a sense. And coming back into it, it really does feel like, as you said now, it's like the emotions that I felt just a few months ago, like those weren't mine. Like there was some, like I was part of them. Like I was definitely contributing to them. I was part of the anger, the anxiety, the joy, the even like the increased adrenaline when we had to run, and all of those things. I was definitely part of it. I have this visual evidence that I was part of it. I filmed everything, and I was live tweeting it, so I know that I was there. But it does feel like there is this disconnect. Like now I'm sitting in my room. I'm not even in Lebanon. I'm in Switzerland for my studies. As it happened, 2 weeks after I landed, pandemic hits, and
Oh my God.
so like basically I came here, and I'm sitting in the aftermath of the initial phase of the revolution. Let's call it that. And I've been kind of just ruminating over them, and I don't even have this direct connection because I'm not in Lebanon now. I don't even have the visual experience, if you want, of seeing the currency depreciating. Like I'm seeing the photos, I'm seeing like Nido is at 80,000, and my friends are obviously there, and they're telling me, and I can sense it. Obviously, I know it's bad. I'm not that disconnected, but it's obviously not the same. And weirdly enough, it kind of takes me to the next question. Although it's a very different context, this sense of wanting to of trying to build something from within, so indoors, because I'm in this flat with my partner, and we've been here for a few months now, and we are trying to build something indoors that is sort of a safe space to a certain extent. And you wrote in your essay that one thing that you actually missed, quote unquote missed, from the Civil War era is this sense of building an internal world that can protect you to a certain extent from the exterior world. And the difficulty with a situation like a pandemic, and I guess even the economic crisis to add to it, is that I don't know, have you managed, let me ask it this way, have you managed to actually create a sort of inner space to a certain extent despite what's happening outdoors?
So it's interesting. So now earlier, like the question that you asked me earlier is like, now when you read these words, how do you reflect on them? I was actually stumped, and I don't think I still can't answer like my relationship to the diary, but this in particular, actually, I can answer it the way that you asked the question before, because what I had written there, now as time progresses, like the feelings become sharper and they come more into relief, and you're like, oh, that's actually what I was feeling. So I have the sense that, so I was like born and raised into the Civil War, and at the beginning of my life, it was like the reality that I knew. And so obviously, I read about this in the essay, and this is something that I always come back to, in fact, is that, so when I long for childhood, I'm always longing for the war. But I also realize now, like, as we get used to, quote unquote, the situation with the pandemic, is that there's also this feeling that whenever disaster strikes, okay, whenever there is like some sort of big disaster, and I'm talking about like a collective disaster, whether it's like the 2006 war, or it's like, بيصير في انفجار, there's like a car bomb, or all of the different upheavals, right, that we've lived through here. Every time it happens, and like everybody is sort of like in tune with one another, and we're like, oh shit, the disaster is here. I feel this incredible sense of relief. I can't even tell you, like, it's like حطيت إجري بمي باردة, that expression of like, I literally feel that, like, I feel like my entire body relaxing, even if I'm panicking on some level, right?
Yeah.
I feel so relaxed, because it feels like I realize that I've been waiting for the disaster the entire time. And now that it's here, and khalas, like, okay, that's it. I don't have to anticipate it anymore. It's here.
Yeah.
So I realize that I'm like, I live my life here consistently and constantly poised on the edge of like, of anticipating disaster, of anticipating this like kind of collective upheaval that is going to take place, and that all of us are going to have to like scurry back indoors and نضب حالنا, and make ourselves really small and go back into these squirrel nests, and like, make your life in this tiny place. And it really is, I mean, ultimately it's like, it's almost like تعفيك, what's the word in English, like forgives you, or forgives you. It's not quite
you,
right.
Like, it gives you permission to I don't know.
Yes, it's like, exactly, it gives you permission. It's like
exempts you from
exempts, exactly, that is exact. I was like, what is it, when you can't go to the military, you can't do your
exempts,
military service. Perfect. Yes, it exempts you from like just surviving is enough. You know what I mean? Like, that's it. It's like, you got to the end of the day, you're intact, you're healthy, you're fine. That's it. عملت اللي عليك. You've done exactly what you're supposed to do. And this, we can call this like a successful day, because you came to the end of it still breathing, still fine, and everything is good. It's like a sort of it's like a relief from the everyday drudgery of living on the one hand. Like in the beginning, I'm saying, now that it's dragged on, it's like a different feeling. But it's when the disaster first hits, it's like all of a sudden I feel like there's like a membrane that has been pulled back, and I'm like pressed up against the skin of like the real world, like the one that has been there all along, which is the world of the disaster, or of stress, or and then it feels like everything else that we've been doing, which is like the sort of the everyday business of living our lives. You go to work, you do this, you do that, you chit chat with your friends, like all of that was just like a veneer on whatever this is, which is this is real life. Like, oh, I know that this is real life, and this is what I've been waiting for the entire time, and then sort of the normal conception of time just stops. And it's always this feeling of incredible relief. And then I feel like that I can retreat into myself the way that I've always wanted to retreat into myself, which is with complete abandon, and I don't feel responsible toward anything or anyone outside my own mind, you know?
Yeah.
You sort of regress into this place. Obviously now I'm feeling very differently, but that's definitely how I was feeling when I wrote that piece, you know?
Yeah, no, and I understand this fairly well.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. I'm sure. I mean, because like, you know, we're not like contemporaries in terms of like the, you know, where like the age, like our ages, and so the phases that we grew up. But I think that largely the experience of living and growing up in this country there is something that is quite, you know, that we sort of understand
Yeah.
each other, and we understand these things very well.
I've one of the things that I'm trying, like one of the purposes of doing this, in a sense, is kind of like trying to figure out if other people feel like me, so I don't feel like I'm crazy. And I've had conversations with Andrew Arsene, who's a Lebanese scholar at Cambridge, and he has this book called Lebanon, a Country in Fragments. I've had a conversation with Fadi Bardawil, who's also a Lebanese academic.
Yeah, that I listened to that. It was excellent. Yeah.
Thanks. So in that one, he is basically talking about people who really grew up like in the post, like in the 40s and the 50s, in the post Nakba-ish era, and so they kind of came to age in the 60s, and that was their whole world. And he was reading this as someone who grew up, who really experienced the Civil War, and so he was talking to me as someone who really experienced the quote-unquote post-war era, and it was just incredible, like the echoes. Like obviously not everything is the same, you know, things change, but there are these commonalities, these common themes that seem to be repeating themselves to certain extents. And on the one hand, like it can, depending on my you know, mood or state of mind, this realization can be very depressing. And on the other hand, the realization can be a bit of like a light bulb moment. I don't actually know what the light bulb refers to, so I don't actually know what the answer is, so to speak, but it's just kind of like it's like, okay, well, this makes sense. So like at this point in my thinking, or at this point in what I'm trying to get at, trying to understand the past whatever years in Lebanon, my research it's more or less the post-war era. So my life is, I keep on saying like my PhD is about me, so I'm just trying to understand myself. And
Yeah,
you know,
I think that's the most honest assessment of any sort of study that we undertake in some ways, you know.
Because it is, I mean, you know,
Absolutely.
I did get into this. I decided, no one asked me to do this. I don't, to this day, I'm not 100% sure why I ended up doing this, but it's starting to produce answers. Let's put it that way. Although the answers are always kind of incomplete. But I'll make a weird segue here, and I think people who've listened to some of the previous episodes probably learned by now that I'm very bad at segues. But I'm very curious always, like when people have certain relationship with books, specific books. So Salim Haddad, previous guest, his book, quote unquote, is The Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa. In my case, I have a number of books by James Baldwin that I end up reading time and time again. You mentioned in your essay one of the stories, one of the books by Primo Levi.
The last book he wrote.
The last book he wrote, The Drowned and the Saved, exactly.
Yeah.
I haven't actually read it myself yet. I have the entire collection of Primo Levi just in front of me actually now while we're talking, but I haven't got into it yet. Can you talk about why that book? Why did you feel that it was relevant to kind of mention it in this essay that talks in general about like revolution and pandemic in the context of Lebanon?
So I read this book the first time like maybe 2-3 years ago. So rereading it was not, it wasn't like, oh, it's been ages since I've read it. I had like certain parts of it that were, you know, that I could still see in my mind's eye, but like only the outlines of them. And I mean, so my entire life is sort of been like, I've always known that I've always written and I've always known that I want to write and whatever. But like my entire life in some ways has also been I keep coming back to the question of not so much like what does it matter, but how do you balance the urgency of writing or the desire to write, which in many ways I experience as kind of a selfish thing. I don't think that selfish is the right word here, frankly, because it applies a kind of morality to it that I
Yeah.
don't want to. But like it's a very private interiority, and it's a thing where you really are. You sort of are. It's like I'm making a hand gesture that you can't see that like perfectly encapsulates what I want to say right now. But like you're sort of going inward, right? In order, like you
Yeah.
connect with everything else by going inward. And but like we live in this world, like in the Arab world, that is just consistently beset by crisis, and by the kind of upheaval that you really feel, or at least I really feel, the need to respond to constantly, and the need to speak to, in some ways, even if my work is not, I might be interested in exploring other things, but like it's that kind of feeling of like, well, how can this just happen? And I need to be able to speak to this for myself, like to kind of reconcile myself to this world where these absolutely terrible, horrible things keep happening. Like yesterday I was reading the story about like the gunman who went into a maternity ward in Afghanistan. It's the kind of horror that defies, imagination. And so I always think about writers who lived terrible things or lived in terrible times and were able to, not just continue writing, but like to speak to the times in which they lived, in whether in direct or indirect ways. And so when I first picked up The Drowned and the Saved and I started reading it, I don't even know how to describe the feeling. It was like, it was just astounding. I felt like I had been, picked up and turned upside down and like shaken and then kind of put back in my place. But like now nothing was kind of in the same place that it had been before, and because, if you want to talk about like the absolute experience of the kind of evil that human beings are capable of doing to one another, it is the Holocaust. And Primo Levi survived the Holocaust. He survived Auschwitz and lived to tell the tale. And so the book is just a series of essays, so reflecting on a lot of different issues, having to do with his experience of the Holocaust and also of writing about having lived that. I mean, what I love about this book and is just he never deals in broad categories, right? He is incredibly precise, like even at the expense of his own pain, What I mean by he doesn't deal in broad categories is like in many ways, the story of the Holocaust, and I think maybe that's why it also like appeals to Americans so much, is like it is a story of like good and evil, right? It's kind of the closest you can come. Like Nazism and what the Germans did is like pure evil. There's absolutely no justification. There's no sense of saying you cannot come and say, well, they were colonized and, then this happened to them. And, like the way that you might be able to justify sort of other atrocities. There's zero justification for what happened, and the scale of the evil is just also so massive. And and yet, like, so one of the essays, it's called The Gray Zone, and he talks about the different relationships of people like in the lagers, in the camps, and he sort of examines the image of like the good Nazi, and then also like the Jewish collaborator, quote unquote. And so he shows you like all of the spectrum of human behavior that actually exists even within this sphere of like what you perceive as like the absolute evil, but he never absolves anybody of of the bad that they did. That's not like it's he doesn't provide any easy answers. He doesn't give you any opportunity to say, oh, yes, that's the way things are. You walk away from every essay like incredibly troubled, but it just in kind of the most transformative way. And he never lets you sit with any answer, so that you can kind of feel good about having understood this. You are just consistently troubled, you know. As you should be, right? And then the final essay in the book also is one that I think is incredible. It's called Letters from Germans. And so he talks about like after he published, after he published his book, his memoir of surviving Auschwitz, which I think is called, it's got two titles. I think one of them is If This Be a Man.
Yeah, this was a man.
Yeah, If This Was a Man. Yeah. And anyway, so he talks about like how all of the letters that he received from Germans after the book was published, and also like so there were a couple of people with whom he had long correspondences, and other people that just wrote him one-off letters, and I think he responded to quite a few people. So he talks about the correspondence that he had. And of course, there were all kinds of Germans that wrote to him, essentially, to borrow like a very modern term, who were kind of like virtue signaling, like this is, so terrible what happened. And, we didn't know, we didn't know what was happening. And, sorry, I want to go back and just say one thing is like, he also talks about the experience of having had that book translated into German, right? So before the Germans start writing to him is like, well, what does it mean for him to have this book translated into German? He wrote it in Italian, but like now it's being translated for the people that he didn't know that he was writing it for, so it's not like he was writing it as a polemic, unto the German people, but now that it was going to be translated, so he was very afraid that anything would be lost in translation, But he ended up having, an excellent translator who was, a dissenter and who had left Germany and refused to even live in Germany during the Holocaust, during the World War II. Anyway, so just the reading that essay as well and seeing all of his mixed feelings around this and seeing the way that he does have this long correspondence with especially like one of his German interlocutors. Her name is Hetty, I think. And again, he never absolves anyone. He never gives you easy answers. It's not this happy ending of like, despite the fact that she was German, and I was a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, that we were able to meet in the middle and celebrate our humanity. Like that's such a facile, he doesn't even go there. That's not even what he's trying to write about or talk about. I don't know. I feel like I'm throwing all these words at you, like it's kind of a heap of words, and like absolutely not able to qualify like why this book is just such a sublime thing. And so for me, it was like, okay, shid halik shway, like if you are feeling depressed, because right now you're about to go through this this terrible thing, this economic crisis, this, that everybody is losing their livelihoods. There's this incredible injustice, the violence, the state violence that is happening. You need to be able to look at how somebody dealt with the absolute worst atrocity and was able to write about it in this just, I don't have the word. It's not even illuminating, and it's like, and I feel like he paid a very high price for it. It was the last book that he wrote before he committed suicide. But he was able to illuminate things that, is just, and he wasn't writing theoretically. He lived this, like he lived this evil. This happened to him and to his body and to everybody surrounding him. And yet he's able to offer up like such a vast understanding of everything that he went through, you know, and what it meant to talk about it and what it meant to have it translated. And, you know, I could talk about it forever. So,
No, I mean
sorry.
that honestly there is. I mean, when I asked the question, I wasn't expecting a specific answer, and the way you answered it, I feel, is the best representation of that answer. It's how this is. I have, as I said, I haven't read the Drown in the Sea. I've read C'est questo un uomo. I've read If This Was a Man, and yes, that is something that there are certain authors that there's something about them that separates them from others. Probably that's like a topic for a conversation in itself. That is how I feel about James Baldwin. That's definitely how Salim Haddad, from what he told me, felt about, towards Fernando Pessoa. Since actually our talk with him, I ended up finishing the Book of Disquiet, which I started just before having the conversation, and I definitely see where he's coming from. And it's one of those books that you just like you would revisit from time to time, because it's not really meant to be read in one sitting anyway. It doesn't. There's no timeline, and it isn't that kind of coherence. But speaking of literature in general, you obviously, you're a translator. You work in that world to various extents, and you translate between English and Arabic. Can you talk a bit about? You have two essays on LitHub. The second one is the topic of the first part of this conversation. The first one is the one about you're reflecting on what it meant for you to be translating Syrian women from Arabic into English, and kind of living with the words, essentially living with those experiences. Can you, if you can talk a bit about that, and as a kind of squeeze in an extra question, like how would you describe your relationship with these two main languages that you have, Arabic and English, and other languages as well? You can throw them in as well, obviously, but especially between Arabic and English.
So the way I've always thought about it, it's like, is that I feel in Arabic, but I think in English, and so which is interesting, because I realized, how can I put this? It's funny because now I'm thinking, I'm like, I actually have a diary entry about this. I wrote about it when I was like, during that phase when I was just thinking aloud. I was working on that journal, really. I mean, I keep journals off and on, but it was just because I felt so unable to do anything else. But anyway, so my the more that I kind of it's not even think about it. It's like, as I move forward in my life and my experiences, I realize that the visceral experience of the thing happens in Arabic, but I can't, express myself in writing in Arabic well enough to be able to write about it in that language. So essentially, all of my experience of writing is like an act of translation. So every time I'm writing anything, I'm aware, or even not aware, but like, that I am translating this experience from the language in which I lived it and the language in which I feel it most strongly into the language that I think in, right? So it's the language in which I dissect things. I have a kind of more sober-minded and إذا بدك, quote unquote, objective take on things, which it's not so much that it's objective as much as it feels divorced enough from the experience that that I can look at it with a kind of dispassionate, or not as passionate, let's say, outlook, but by that same token, I also feel like it's almost like when I'm writing in English, what I'm writing somehow feels fake to me. I don't know how to express it, but it's almost like
is it because the audience wouldn't be the same?
Yes, absolutely. I'm actually looking for this thing. I'm like, I wrote it, like, I think I wrote it oh yeah, okay. So here I was talking about like one of the meetings I had in like the revolution group, when we were planning for the night before, because it starts tomorrow. We must wake at 6 to ready ourselves and be down by the Monroe Hotel at 7 a.m. to help form a human chain, blah, blah. So I'm sort of describing that and describing the meeting and how they were talking about like what to do with the phones and like, to sort of like set it up so that you can remote erase your phone من بعيد and stuff. So I said, I won't, so I talk about this, and then I say, I won't be doing anything to my phone. There's nothing on it. Also, none of this feels real to me. It's hard to explain, but even in that room, hearing them talk like that about security measures and what to do about your phone, etc., it felt like little boy war games, even though I know it's real. It just feels like it couldn't possibly happen to me, maybe because I'm not real. I'm not sure how I know even how to articulate this, though after typing the words, it just feels like I took my hands off the keyboard and sat there slack-jawed for a few minutes, because all I could think was it's not real in English. In English, it feels fake, like I'm just telling a story without real-world stakes. For someone else's benefit also, a performance of sorts. And I had all these rapid-fire thoughts, one after the other, which I guess I've already written about in the first translation essay, but as a child, the war happened around me in Arabic and I escaped into English books. And in those English books, there was nothing ever remotely resembling the war the way I lived it. Because even if the books described hardship and difficulty, or rather discomfort, etc., these things were described and lived all in English, divorced from the entire sensual context of the war, part of which, a huge part of which, was Arabic. The sound of the newscasters' voices and the words they used, hudna, fitna, ishtibakat, ma'arik, the sound of my father's voice raised in laughter or challenge as the adults dealt a new hand of cards and yelled giddily at one another throughout the match. How it shocks me now to think that they were younger than I am now, or at least my dad was my age, I think, not more. Just the sound of Arabic as meaning and as music. And music too, its rhythms and lyrics. I had a language for reality and a language for fantasy. And somehow now, as a result, nothing ever feels fully real anymore because I live things mostly in Arabic and then I process them in English. And when I process and write them in English like this, taking the words outside of my head and putting them on paper, forcément, sorry, this word works only in French, there is an English language reader there immediately, some anonymous person, but even so, because they are reading in English, they are indulging in a fantasy. They are headlong inside something not real. And so my own experience being written instantly also becomes not real. Not in the way that anything written becomes not real, i.e. hyper-real, constructed, artfully rendered, structured in art, etc., but just simply unlived and unlivable, divorced from a body and therefore no longer belonging to it. I don't know if that makes sense or is even true. So that's
it's sort of out-of-body experience to a certain extent as well.
Yes. I mean, it's exactly, yeah, it's kind of an out-of-body experience in the sense of like not anchored in the body. Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't know how to end conversations. This has been really, really interesting. Honestly, I will definitely would have you on again if that's okay with you.
I love talking. I feel like we've had a conversation before. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like, oh yeah, hi, It just feels very natural and easy is what I'm saying,
I'm glad to hear that. It's one of the things that I'm trying to explore because, especially for those who were on the ground since October, there is something that has been shared, and I guess I'm trying to flesh it out into a certain extent, first in this format, and at some point when my brain is functioning again, I'll try and write about it as well. But is there anything that, I don't know, anything we could have expanded upon, but like my question wasn't good, or I don't know. Is there anything that is there a final note that you want to end on?
Yes, actually, it's funny. Like, بالعكس, not. I feel like we covered out like so many intense things in such a short amount of time. But there is something I want to say, and it speaks to like us talking about this collective experience that we shared separately and together, and and sort of can be spliced anywhere. So a dear friend of mine, Mary Germanos, made this film about the labor movements the 60s and 70s, هون بلبنان, and the Ghandour factory uprising. And she also talks about the Ghandour factory worker strikes and the tobacco farmers uprising, and sort of talks about like, she made this like really beautiful kind of essayistic film about, these labor movements and those early revolutions that, and then afterwards were kind of like superseded by the Civil War. I'm not going to say they led to the Civil War. Anyway, I hope I'm doing the film justice. But the title of the film, which is taken from, like one of the things that her character says. So its English translation is A Feeling Greater Than Love. Okay. I actually haven't told her this, but it just kept coming back to me, that title, شعور أكبر من الحب, a feeling greater than love, the whole time that I was down there. I mean, it remains something like I cannot write about it or think about like those early days now without getting like really choked up, and it's very much like being in love, in the sense that all the cliches become true, everything that everybody told you about, you're like, okay, you hear about it, whatever, it's in theory, but then you explain it and you're like, oh my God, it's true. It does feel like lightning struck you. It does feel like, the whole world is turned upside down. Like, like even it imbues even cliche with meaning. Like even the emptiest turn of phrase, it like loads it with meaning, and I just keep thinking of that. Like, it's like, of course, so there's love that exists between you and another person. And it's, and it's this like transformative thing. And it alters your contours and their contours and everything. And, but to have that happen on this massive scale of like all these bodies and these people pressed together, and this sense of like everybody being able to agree that, whatever reality we want, it's not this one in which we're living. I think the problems start coming when everybody articulates what their version of utopia is. And then like, that's when people start arguing. But at least everybody is united in like, whatever we want to live is not this, like enough with this shit. And, I just, that's what I want to say is like, it's just that the idea of a feeling greater than love is something that, it was a title that I read and understood and watched the film and loved the film and, all of these things. But then all of a sudden I got to have that experience. I got to know what that feeling greater than love is. And I feel so incredibly grateful for it. Like, just, if I like, of all of the experiences that I have lived in my life, I think that I wouldn't trade this one for the world. Again, there's like no words adequate for this, but I'm just so grateful that I like, of the full range of human experiences that a person can have, in a human body, that I don't know that there's anything that transcends this,
That's a wonderful way of ending it, actually. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this, Joey, really.
I did as well. Thanks a lot for your time.